The Atlantic coast of North America is not a straight line. It is a landscape of rivers, inlets, barrier islands, and deepwater harbors. A geography that, to the right eye, looks less like a continent and more like an opportunity. European empires that came here in the 16th and 17th centuries utilized it as a network of natural checkpoints, trade routes, and defensive positions to be claimed, fortified, and held. For the past few weeks, my team and I traveled the Atlantic coast to answer this question. Where did European powers derive their foundations of colonial influence in the American South? We postulated that in the colonial American South, it was either the military or geography that was paramount to the colonial successes of each individual colony. To explore these ideas, we spoke with experts in Charleston, Savannah, Jacksonville, and St. Augustine.
Situated on the confluence of the Ashley and Cooper rivers, Charlestown was founded in 1670. The piece of land named Albemarle Point became a major foothold of British colonial rule in the region. But the settlement's location was never accidental. Charleston sat at the center of an enormous geographic network. The harbor opened directly into the Atlantic Ocean, while the Ashley and Cooper rivers connected the port to inland plantations and trade routes. Ships could unload goods from across the Atlantic and funnel them deep into the colony through the river systems.
But only a decade after its founding, colonists moved the settlement across the Ashley River, here to Oyster Point, where the settlement of Charleston remains today.
Obviously, moving to the peninsula and having access to the harbor, but shifting the peninsula was much more beneficial for port trade, and it's a more defendable area because it's, kind of this bay area.
When you have those big economic drivers, you also need to be on the highway, which in this case was the port of Charleston. So even from the very beginning, they had their eye on the peninsula between the Ashley and Cooper rivers as not only a defensive location that would be good, but also one that had a very deep natural harbor, especially along the Cooper River side, where they could establish a really world-class port city.
The new location offered deeper water, higher ground, and natural protection on multiple sides. By surrounding the city with waterways, English leaders transformed Charlestown into both a seaport and a defensive stronghold. The importance of this geography led the British to become that much more ambitious. Here, at the meeting point of the two rivers and an open ocean, the British saw something they could not afford to leave unfortified or unoccupied. The risk of allowing this geographic location to fall into the wrong hands was too high.
Any kind of successful settlement had to be on that water, and it had to be in a good location for trade, but also in the initial calculation also had to be very defensible.
And they actually very early on wall it up.
As the colony expanded, Charleston rapidly became one of the biggest trade centers in all of British North America.
Early commerce revolved around the export of natural resources, like timber, naval stores, and especially deerskins, which at one point accounted for nearly half of the colony's export revenue. Over time, however, Charleston's economy shifted toward plantation agriculture, powered by enslaved African labor. Rice, indigo, and eventually Sea Island cotton transformed South Carolina into one of the wealthiest British colonies. By the mid-1700s, Charleston had grown into the largest and richest city south of Philadelphia and a major hub of the Atlantic trade network.
Charleston was the wealthiest per capita city in British North America and was the fourth largest city in British North America. But the insane wealth that Rice brought is all on the backs of enslaved people.
As trade grew, The institution of slavery became paramount to both the economic and cultural development of the city, a legacy that was retained long after the Civil War.
From 1700s to 1775, 40% of enslaved peoples entering North America entered through Charleston, right here.
That same port that made Charleston the envy of the British colonial world was also the point of entry for one of the largest forced migrations in human history. The waterfront was both the source of the city's wealth and its largest slave trade site. Those two facts were never separate, they were the same.
It was really the knowledge that the West Africans who were brought here not of their own volition, involuntarily had, that made the rice culture work. So there are traditions from the Gullah culture like music, art, basketry, food, cuisine that inform even how we live today. So
Gadsden's Wharf, one of the largest wharfs in North America, stretching 840 feet along the Cooper River, became the point of entry for tens of thousands of enslaved Africans in the final years of the legal slave trade. The coastline that gave Charleston its power also gave it its shame.
Throughout Charleston's history, it remained under constant attack from Spanish and French forces. This was due to its economic value as well as its pinpoint perfect positioning. Despite this, for all of its colonial history, it remained in British control. This was due in part to its peninsular shape, but also due to fortifications and armaments like this one.
Those fortifications were no afterthought. From the moment colonists settled at Oyster Point, they began building defenses, such as walls and gun batteries. Those walls were what separated Charleston from other British settlements. Charleston was the only city in British North America that the British saw fit to surround with a fortified wall.
Charleston becomes really the only English walled city to be built in North America.
The walls showed what the British valued. Inside those walls sat rice, indigo, and the slave trade that funded colonial expanse across the American South. To lose Charleston to Spain, to France, to pirates, or to its own colonists would have been to lose the financial engine of the Southern Empire. It was the only place the British decided could not, under any circumstances, fall. In 1706, a combined French and Spanish fleet attacked from the sea. The militia drove them back. Again, in 1718, the pirate Blackbeard blockaded the harbor. Both times the defenses held, thanks to the preparations as well as the geography. In this way, Charleston was more than just a port. It was a system involving its geography, commerce, fortification, and forced labor, all operating together. To control Charleston was to control the rivers behind it, the trade flowing through it, and the coastline extending in both directions.
Founded in 1733 by General James Oglethorpe, Savannah was created as a buffer, a wall of English settlement planted between South Carolina's wealth and the Spanish forces pressing north out of Florida. As Savannah was also under British control, it fell under a similar strategy to Charleston. It was deliberately placed, deliberately designed, and deliberately useful to the empire. But since Charleston was the prize, Savannah was the shield.
The site Oglethorpe chose was not at random. 17 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, Savannah sits atop Yamacraw Bluff, a high ridge of firm ground rising above the Savannah River, one of few elevated positions on an otherwise flat, marshy coastline.
And that elevation was everything. It gave the settlement commanding views of river traffic below, natural drainage, and protection from tidal flooding, which would ravage settlements at any lower elevation.
The Savannah River itself stretches deep into the continent, connecting the coast to the interior in a single unbroken waterway. Goods flowed down from inland plantations and trading posts, funneled through the city, and were loaded onto ships bound for England. The river was both the city's highway and its lifeline. Like the Ashley and Cooper rivers feeding Charleston's ports, the Savannah River was an imperial pipeline as well.
My name is Stan Deaton, Standeaton. I'm the senior historian at the Georgia Historical Society. I have worked here for 28 years. In June, I came here directly out of graduate school. I got an undergraduate degree in journalism from the University of Georgia. I got a master's degree in history from the University of Georgia and a PhD in history from the University of Florida. And I have been here, as I said, for 28 years, and I'm interested really in American history broadly, from the colonial period all the way through yesterday.
Can you explain the geographic advantages of Savannah's position on the Savannah River?
It was established for many different reasons, but geography had everything to do with it because, as I said, it was a buffer colony between English South Carolina, which was, of course, a great exporter of indigo and rice, which was enormously important to the empire, but it also provided a military buffer between Spanish Florida and South Carolina. So this was an ideal location. James Oglethorpe represented the trustees, and he came out with the original colonists in 1733. They landed here. He had scouted this area. So he met with some rangers who came over from South Carolina, and they sailed up the Savannah River. So we're not actually on the ocean here. So we're inland, which is also a defensive maneuver. They established the town of Savannah here on what was a bluff. Still today, if you go down to River Street, you will notice that you have to walk down a pretty steep set of stairs to get down to the river. It was exactly that way in 1733 when they landed here. So the town of Savannah grew from that period, but it was established here, very particularly here on the bluff above the river, for a very specific reason.
But Savannah's geography extended beyond the river. The city was surrounded on multiple sides by tidal marshlands, miles of salt marsh, creek, and barrier islands that made amphibious assault extraordinarily difficult. Any enemy approaching by sea faced not just fortifications, but a labyrinth of coastal geography that punished the unfamiliar. The same marshes that seemed like obstacles were in fact Savannah's first line of defense.
What makes Savannah unique among other colonial cities is that its military strategy is not just within its walls, but also within its streets.
Oglethorpe designed the city around a repeating series of squares, blocks of land surrounded by housing and public buildings. Each square served as a training ground for the militia. The grid of streets between them allowed defenders to move quickly and fire lines to remain clear.
Oglethorpe city plan is really unique. No one is quite sure where he got the idea from. Philadelphia had been a planned city also, but the idea originally was for these squares that Oglethorpe laid out, and Savannah, to its credit, has maintained this system throughout its history for almost 300 years now. But each square was laid out and something of with a military design, an economic design. There were businesses and there were homes on each square. And so the southern limits of the town, which are what is today Liberty Street, if you look at a map, was sort of the southern limit of the city. And it was a defensive buffer there, with the idea that any enemy would come up from the south. The squares were a good way to concentrate population, and that around the squares, they were called tithing lots. Some were domestic for people to live, some were for businesses, and some were for military. And so people drilled on the squares from the very beginning. It was always seen, again, as there's a military reason for establishing this colony. So from the beginning, the squares are now these beautiful things that people walk through. They're integral to Savannah's economy, which is heavily dependent upon tourists. But from the beginning, they have been very important to the way Savannah developed and grew.
And the fortifications didn't end at the city's edge. Oglethorpe constructed a network of outposts radiating southward along the coast. Savannah was the anchor of an entire coastal defense system, a chain of fortified positions stretching from the Georgia Barrier Islands northward toward Charleston, designed to absorb, deflect, and exhaust any threat approaching from the south.
Within a decade of the city's founding, the first commercial properties began to pop up along the banks of the Savannah River. Today, it's mostly hotels and tourist attractions, but in the mid-1700s, it was primarily warehouses for all of the imports and exports, not just for Savannah, but for the entire colony and much of the South.
The people, I mentioned the trustees, who founded Georgia did not want to follow South Carolina's model, where there were gigantic land holdings and a black majority. So from the beginning, land holding was supposed to be confined to small yeoman farmers, families who would come here. Slavery was banned. Let's be clear, not because anybody was an abolitionist, and not because they thought slavery was bad for black people, but because it made white people lazy. They wanted to follow a different model. But from the beginning, these two cities competed. In the 19th century, as railroads, it's sort of like, where's the railroad going to end, in Savannah or Charleston? So Savannah and Charleston have always been in this brotherly, sisterly kind of argument with each other about which one was most important, which one is going to be the place that has the best ties both with the West Indies, with the northern cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. It started from the very beginning. Charleston had a huge head start. They had a governing aristocracy made up of merchants and big landholders. So it's from the very beginning, these two cities have sort of been not literally at each other's throats, but they have competed with each other, and they still do.
The goods moving through Savannah were the commodities of the empire. Deerskins, rice, and indigo came downriver from trading networks, loaded onto ships, and then sent off to European markets. At its peak in the colonial era, Savannah was exporting over 2 million pounds of deerskins annually, enough to rival Charleston's long-standing dominance of the South Atlantic trade. Although Charleston was the clear commercial capital of the South, Savannah was a hungry, younger port with high growth potential. When Oglethorpe first founded Georgia, he banned slavery, but the ban collapsed within 2 decades under economic pressure from planters who watched South Carolina grow rich and demanded the same tools. By 1751, slavery was legalized in Georgia, and the cycle of slave exploitation continued.
And here, in the right square, we have the grave of Tomochichi, the leader of the Yamakura tribe. He settled on the Savannah River long before the British arrived. It is because of his alliance and his power that Savannah was able to flourish against the Spanish Florida attacks. Without his help, there would be no Savannah.
Before there was a Charleston, before there was a Savannah, before the English had planted a single flag on the continent's eastern coast, there was St. Augustine. Founded in 1565, the city is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the present-day United States. When the Pilgrims were still in England, dreaming of a new world, St. Augustine had already survived pirate raids, sieges, fires, and a hurricane. But this city did not survive because it was resilient. It survived because of where it sat.
St. Augustine sits on the western shore of Matanzas Bay, a long, shallow lagoon tucked behind Anastasia Island, which is a barrier island that stretches for miles along the coastline and shields the city from the sea. Although fortifications were abundant, The city was primarily protected by its geography.
The harbor was shallow, preventing large warships from entering. Additionally, the inlets were choke points, and there were only a few of them.
Here on the gun deck of Castillo de San Marcos, we see the true power of the colonial city of St. Augustine. This fort is situated on the north side of the city to protect both its harbor and its land routes. And additionally, it's situated on a bluff, which gives it the strategic height advantage to see over your invaders. It's the same kind of engineering that they planned in Savannah.
The Castillo de San Marcos is made of a pale, porous sedimentary material, coquina. It's made from compressed seashells. It's soft enough to carve, but when hit by a cannonball, it doesn't shatter. It absorbs. In 1702, the English governor of Carolina led an army south and besieged St. Augustine for weeks. He burned the city to the ground, but the Castillo was the only structure left standing. In 1740, James Oglethorpe marched south and tried again. He blockaded the water and cut St. Augustine's supply line from Havana. Yet, the Spanish held on, and Oglethorpe had to withdraw. The Castillo was never taken in battle, not once. Spain, desperate, traded Florida for Havana, and the British took the deal. When the British finally came to own this fort in 1763, they did not win in battle. They couldn't. They received it in a boardroom in Paris.
The city's port became an essential resupply point for British ships, and its forts secured the coastline. In the fall of 1778, British General Augustin Prevost marched soldiers north from St. Augustine, pushed through Georgia, and captured Savannah.
The dominant effect of coastal geography can be seen. You control St. Augustine, you threaten Savannah. You control Savannah, you threaten Charleston. The coast was a chain, while St. Augustine was the southernmost link.
Georgia tried 3 times to take St. Augustine, all failures. The geography and defensive fortifications set up before the city stumped every Patriot attack. Eventually, St. Augustine was ceded a second time by treaty in the 1783 Peace of Paris. The city that was never taken in battle twice lost its sovereignty at the negotiating table.
This plaza has been the economic and civic capital of the city since it was planned by the Spanish. The British kept it that way, but what they did change was the economy, and they did so aggressively. When the British arrived in 1763, St. Augustine was an economic near zero. The Spanish had largely militarized the colony after decades of attacks and unease. St. Augustine was purely meant to hold the coast for the Spanish. It was never meant to be a commercial hub like Charleston or even Savannah. Under the British, James Grant believed Florida could be transformed. Massive land grants were distributed to influential British subjects to encourage plantation development. Like other southern locations, the cash crops were indigo, rice, timber, and naval stores.
Matter of fact, everything that came off those plantations moved through this waterfront. The goods arrived by river, and they were loaded onto ships bound for British ports and Caribbean markets.
Trade to and from East Florida expanded measurably. St. Augustine was, for the first time in its history, approaching the title of a commercial port.
This gate, or one very much like it, marks the northernmost border of the colonial St. Augustine. Walk through it heading south, and you enter the most fortified and cosmopolitan settlement on the southern Atlantic coast. Walk through it heading north, and you enter a contested country where almost anything was possible.
Fort Most, only 2 miles beyond the city gate, was the first legally sanctioned free black settlement in what is now the United States. Enslaved people who escaped from British plantations in Carolina and Georgia and made the brutal overland journey south were given their freedom by Spanish authorities, inducted into the militia, and ordered to defend St. Augustine from their former enslavers.
By 1763, however, when Britain gained control of St. Augustine, laws protecting the formerly enslaved disappeared. At the same time, under British control, the population of enslaved peoples in St. Augustine exploded, growing exponentially.
British planters from the Carolinas and Georgia brought more than 9,000 enslaved black laborers into the colony within 2 decades. Black people outnumbered white people in East Florida by a ratio of 2 to 1, higher than in any other southern British colony.
Long before Pedro Menendez dropped anchor in Matanzas Bay, this land belonged to the Timucua. They had lived here for thousands of years. When the Spanish arrived in 1565, they landed in the middle of an already inhabited world.
How did indigenous cultures interact with colonial cities as they were developing or growing in trade?
Well, just right across over there is Fort Caroline. So that colony was here for 15 months. Early on, they seemed to try to get along with each other, but I think the indigenous people were always leery of what the intent and the goals of the Spanish were. So they kind of interacted with them kind of on their own terms like they would other indigenous nations that they weren't familiar with. But they pretty much packed up and left after 15 months because they couldn't survive on their own.
The colonists arrived lacking resources and knowledge of the land they had just come across. The Timucua fed them. However, this relationship curdled quickly, as the Spanish didn't come to coexist, they came to claim. Additionally, they enforced a labor system, the repartimiento. This system required the Timucua to grow corn and provide laborers for construction.
In the end, St. Augustine exchanged hands without a fight. In 1763, the British took over the city after the conclusion of the French and Indian War. And while the owner might have changed, the city remains largely the same, with many of its original structures still standing today.
Charleston was Britain's greatest commercial engine, a peninsula cradled between 2 rivers, open to the Atlantic and fortified at every edge. Savannah was a shield, a city carved into a bluff above a river, surrounded by marshlands. And St. Augustine was vital to both Britain and Spain, giving them a southern anchor so geographically impenetrable that in 2 centuries of warfare, no enemy ever took it by force. The logic underneath all of them was identical. In the colonial American South, dominance was determined less by the military strength of European powers and more by geographical advantage. Whoever controlled the ports, rivers, and coastlines controlled the continent. The guns, the walls, the warships were responses to geography. The real strategy was always in the map. Find the deep harbor, claim the high bluff, fortify the narrow inlet. Do that, and everything else, the trade, the wealth, the empire, would follow.
Taking steps to keep my distance. I don't wanna fall.
What we found, traveling this coast, is that the land was never neutral. The rivers pointed inward toward wealth. The harbors opened outward toward power. And the empires that understood that learned to read the coastline the way a sailor reads the wind. The ones that didn't lost it all at a negotiating table, not on a battlefield. The land won. It always did.
Do we all so slowly lose control?
What the Europeans found here in the 16th and 17th centuries, and what they fought so persistently to control, turns out to have been genuinely valuable.
And without meaning to, without planning for it, they built cities in the right places. Cities that are still here, still moving goods, still drawing people, still shaped by the same geography that drew the first ships into the harbor 500 years ago. They came for the empire. They left infrastructure. And the land has been doing the rest ever since.